I used to write all these songs for the Colin McEnroe show. I haven't done it in... I don't even remember the last song I wrote. I feel kind of guilty about that. I don't want him to think, that I'm not, like, pulling my weight around here, so maybe I'll write a song right now. I dropped out of yoga. I dropped out of spinning. I canceled a blood drive, but that was just the beginning. It's the guiltiness song. It's the guiltiness song. I said the Lord's Prayer, but my last word was maybe. I bought infant formula, but I don't have a baby. It's the guiltiness song. It's the guiltiness song. Why, oh why, am I not Rebecca Lobo? She is so well respected, me, I killed a hobo. Cares and doubts, I guess I've had a bunch. I like Diane Orson, it was wrong to eat her lunch. I was so rude to Oprah, I unfriended Bono. I came into work, even though I'm pretty sure I have mono. It's a guiltiness song. It's a guiltiness song. I came to your wedding with booze on my breath. I bought an RV and commenced making... I'm just really kind of, bored with this song. You know what I mean? I just don't feel like finishing it. But then... that's going to make me feel guilty. I mean, you should probably finish what you start, I really should do it. It's just a question of self-discipline. On the other hand, I am at level 79 of Candy Crush. So here's a show with something about there's a host that does it. Don't bother me. I'm busy.
All right. Yeah, she didn't follow through, and that is in fact one of the things that you can wind up feeling guilty about. Right before the show, it occurred to me to print a little part of the Anglican General Confession because it just kind of sums up guilt. We have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. We have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. We have offended against thy holy laws. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done, and there is no health in us. If that doesn't make you feel guilty, we're going to be talking about all those kinds of guilt today. We've got a wonderful group of guests here. In just a few seconds, you're going to meet Jen Dahl, a freelance writer who's contributed to The Atlantic and The Atlantic Wire, New York Times Book Review. I could go on and on. Her new book, Save the Date, will be out in May 2014. Jen's kind of a specialist, I think, in particular, of having left undone those things which we ought to have done. So we'll be talking to Jen in particular about that. Also joining us, well, we've got a whole bunch of exciting guests, and I can't introduce all of them right now. Yeah, I can. Ruth Whitman is a British writer living in California, working on a book proposal about happiness in America. Her work has appeared in the New York Times and elsewhere. We're going to get to her in just a second. We're going to start out with Dr. Hank Schwartz, the psychiatrist-in-chief for Hartford Hospital, the Institute of Living, and director of the Department of Psychiatry. So, Hank, we know each other. Yep. So, the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke said guilt was never a rational thing. It distorts all the faculties of the human mind. It perverts them. It leaves a man no longer in the free use of his reason. It puts him into confusion. Do you go along with that, or does guilt actually do anything useful for us? Does guilt have a function in our lives?
Oh, guilt surely has a function, but I also go along with that statement because guilt is sometimes good and it's sometimes bad. It is sometimes a kind of accurate marker that we have violated our own set of internal rules, but guilt's also based on perception. So we may perceive we've done some things wrong when in reality the world would tell us that we haven't. So it's very confused.
In terms of sort of the state of psychiatry these days, obviously psychiatry is a moving target. It changes. So, and it also doesn't speak with one voice, except in the DSM-5. But talk a little bit about how psychiatry see guilt these days. Probably not as it was seen in Freud's Vienna.
Yeah, well, guilt generally has a bad rap because we tend to think of it in excess. So the first thing that leaps to mind is that guilt is one of the elements of the description of depression in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And when depression is bad, we feel very guilty, hopeless, and worthless. And then, really how we think of guilt as a psychological phenomenon, the distinction between that and the neurobiologic brain dysfunction kind of breaks down. But I think that most psychologists and psychiatrists do see guilt in a kind of balanced way, that moderate amounts of guilt kind of motivate us to follow the rules that we set up for ourselves that reflect our values, but that when guilt really just gets the best of us, when it overruns us, then it drives us to unrealistic expectations, holds us up to harsh judgments that lead to or can lead to joyless lives and significant depression.
Sounds like my life in a nutshell. Well,
we can talk about that later.
Is this billable? So I think maybe one of the distinctions that might be worth making, tell me whether I'm right, is the distinction between self-criticism and self-punishment. In other words, if I'm doing something wrong or something quote-unquote wrong, or something that's, pretty noticeably wrong, if I'm being rotten to my kids, if I'm cheating on my spouse, if I'm stealing from the community chest, I feel guilty in, we would hope, a self-critical way. I know that there's something wrong with what I'm doing. The question probably from a therapeutic standpoint is, what am I doing with it? Am I simply turning it into self-punishment, which is probably a blind alley, or am I trying to figure out what my next step is?
Yeah, well, that's right at that point that sort of defines the difference between the useful or productive guilt and damaging guilt. If we're able to use this sense of awareness of violating our values and our internal sense of right or wrong, that may motivate us to do the right thing for our families, to do the right thing, on our job. There's another related concept here, and that is guilt proneness. So individuals who are prone to guilt, and you might think, oh, God, that's a terrible thing. Who wants to be prone to guilt, walking around and having guilt descend every day? But if you are prone to feel guilty, you may anticipate that if you don't do the right thing in a particular situation, you'll feel guilty, and that may lead you to self-correct and do the right thing, and you may be guilt-prone, therefore, without ever actually having to experience the guilt, because that sense of anticipation keeps you doing the right thing. On the other hand, if you've grown up in a very harsh and judgmental kind of family, and the values that you have incorporated that have sort of formed, Freud called it the superego, really a reflection of our conscience. And if your version of that is harsh and judgmental, then you're likely to find error with yourself where it doesn't even necessarily exist. And that's that punishing, harsh, and judgmental kind of guilt that's very unproductive and really can lead to serious depression.
By the way, if you want to be part of this conversation, and this is Dr. Hank Schwartz you're hearing on Talk, our number is 860-275-7266. You may even have something you want to get off your chest. 860-275-7266. If you want to tweet us, you may tweet us at WNPR Colin. We're going to add our other two guests here in just a second. But, the other question, I guess, is, and this doesn't exist exclusively within the therapeutic model, but is, okay, so what do you do next? And obviously a lot of religious models provide paths to atonement. You have in certain religions the opportunity to confess and atone. Within the therapeutic model, I guess that's sort of the next question is, let's imagine that you have inappropriate amounts of guilt that is either in the way that you just suggested, so highly developed that it guides your every move all day and sometimes even pins you down and paralyzes you, or guilt over one particular thing which has turned into a cycle of self-punishment that isn't really going anywhere. So how does therapy look at that? How does psychiatry look at that?
Well, as you suggested earlier, even within the psychiatric and psychological communities, I know we can't all get together on these things, and there are different therapeutic approaches to this. So Freud really kind of established the concept of the superego and helped us to understand conscience. And from the traditional Freudian therapies, now we think of them as sort of psychodynamic psychotherapies or insight-oriented psychotherapies, would go back and try to bring you back to examine how the values that you currently hold and that you're holding yourself to were initially established. Who were the important figures, early figures in your life that helped you establish the ideal version of yourself that you're constantly trying to live up to? And by bringing you back there in moments perhaps when you may be overly critical of yourself and reflecting on the relationship between your current self-critical stance and your early development, hopefully you develop insight. Well, that was the basic psychodynamic way of doing things. Today there are other therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most evidence-based therapies in psychology and psychiatry, would say, well, it's not really so important to go back and get to the origin of things. What's really important is to learn how to change your thinking. If you're constantly having a self-critical thought, it's to observe that, put up the stop sign, substitute that thought for another sort of more productive way of thinking. And we do know from what we're learning in neuroscience that the brain is changeable. We call it neuroplasticity, and you can kind of create new pathways and new ways of thinking with techniques like that. I believe that both techniques and both approaches are effective and productive.
At the risk of going down a really deep rabbit hole, it seems to be another part of this, particularly in the psychotherapeutic model, to the extent that there is a consistent one, which there isn't, but, is the notion of transference, the patient's transference, the patient's projection of certain qualities onto the therapist that exist in some other place, and possibly even kind of re-identifying the therapist as the giver of laws, as the authority figure, and then negotiating a completely different agreement with the therapist than the one that existed with the original authority figure. And piled on top of that, obviously, is countertransference, the patient's attitude, the therapist's attitude towards the patient. And to me, I've experienced that in therapy. I've had that experience where I renegotiated, to a certain degree, questions of guilt in a condition of transference with a therapist. And to me, that's one of the most useful things therapy can do.
Colin, you know so much about this. I'm wondering if I can book an hour with you later in the day. Sure. Is there a couch around here somewhere? No. The concepts of transference and countertransference are quite important, and you lay them out very well. You bring your baseline conflict into a therapist, and so many of your views of the important people early in your life get transferred to that therapist. You kind of get a chance to work it out a second time. And with regard to conscience and guilt, it's interesting that there are different levels of superego or conscience formation. So in the most primitive level, we hold ourselves to having to do things out of fear that we'll be caught. Mm-hmm. At the highest, at the next step, we may pursue what we consider to be the values our parents held. And so at the lowest level, I do something because I'll be punished. At the next level, I may do things because this is the way my parents did it and their parents before them. And at the highest level, we do it because we have internalized our own sense of right and wrong. Working in a therapy with a therapist, bringing your transferential reactions to the therapist can help you to take the steps from a more primitive way of holding yourself to your values and the rules that you've adopted to a much more sophisticated and mature one.
All right. The conversation's about guilt. We're going to add our other two guests in here in the next segment. We'd love to add you in, too, if you've got the guts to call us. 860-275-7266. I wouldn't, but you might. 860-275-7266. You may tweet us at WNPR Colin. More guilt when we get back.
Can you think of anything specific recently that you feel guilty about?
I committed to helping a friend move, and I'm unfortunately not able to do it. So now I really feel bad about that.
Well, I stole like 3 chapsticks.
I was lying to someone.
Sometimes when I don't do the right thing, that makes me feel guilty.
Has feeling guilty ever made you change your plans?
Oh, yeah, of course. Self-guilt is a lot. If I don't get up early enough on a morning, I'm guilty. So the next day I get up on time because I think, oh, I'm wasting the day.
If I've overcommitted to something and there are 2 things and I get guilty about one of them, yeah, definitely.
When I felt guilty, I talked to the person, I confessed to it, and then it got better afterwards. So.
All right, so we're talking about guilt. Dr. Hank Schwartz, psychiatrist-in-chief, Hartford Hospital Institute of Living. He's here in studio with me. We're going to add to the conversation 2 other voices. Let's start with Jen Dahl, a freelance writer, as I said, contributed to The Atlantic Wire, a bunch of other places. Jen, as I said at the beginning, I think one of your specialties is those things which have been left undone, which we ought to have done. You know, Hank used the phrase self-critical thoughts, plagued by self-critical thoughts. Do you find you're plagued by self-critical thoughts?
I think as any writer would agree that they're plagued constantly by self-critical thoughts. And I think it's interesting the levels of guilt that we feel. So some of these self-critical thoughts may not matter at all, and others can be hugely both invigorating and force you to try harder, and then sometimes maybe go down that bad road of darkness and sadness and I'm not good enough. But I think that there are many different levels of guilt that I feel every day.
One of the things you wrote about was guilt, and this is perhaps a more garden variety form of guilt. Although I also, let me preface that by saying, if you start to look at it that way, you can almost see your day as just a huge quilt of things that you either do or don't do because of guilt. Right. Food choices you make, exercise choices you make, all kinds of choices you make.
Totally.
And you've written about the guilt of not finishing books.
Right. And I guess for me, you know, I don't feel guilty about not finishing books. I think sometimes you tackle your guilt and you say, this is not something that's going to bother me because there's way too much else out there that actually is important. So with books, you know, if they're not grabbing you by the first 50 pages or 100 pages, I feel okay about setting them aside and moving on because there are so many good books out there. Now, if it was about writing my own book and I didn't finish it, I would feel terribly guilty.
Yeah. What do you feel guilty about? Because Hank can help you change your thought process.
Oh, gosh, drinking too many wines.
Well, actually, after you've had 2 glasses of wine, we can't change your thought process anymore.
No, then you become belligerent, right? No. And you feel guilty about what you've done.
Right. Although, but that's an interesting question. Okay, so Hank, she brings up, and I don't know whether that's guilt or regret, but something that you do repeatedly that you know that you don't want to do, but and it seems almost more a problem of impulse control. I'm not speaking specifically to Jen. I don't know how much of a disorder she has, but just generally speaking, and there it seems like the cognitive behavioral model is going to work better than some kind of more traditional psychodynamic approach.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And poor impulse control is a major part of the whole guilt equation, particularly in people who are psychopaths who don't actually really feel guilt, but do things more driven by the degree of impulse control and control over their longings and desires. But yes, I think that rather than spending a whole lot of time trying to understand why one goes for the second glass of wine or whatever it is that you're doing, there are behavioral techniques that probably are helpful.
You know, Jen Dahl, he talks about sociopaths and psychopaths, and I feel as though in an environment, the environment we're in now, where we're brought closer through digital culture to all kinds of people that we would probably have never met, increasingly, I feel like we do meet some version of these people. I mean, we're talking today about guilt as if it's our problem, or at least sometimes our problem, but the other feature of life is people who do not experience enough guilt at all, or any guilt at all. And we see them in popular culture. I think most frighteningly, Todd in Breaking Bad, the character played by Jesse Plemons. You just see this character who doesn't really seem to process any sense of remorse. He's this complete blank screen, and there's actually a new character on Boardwalk Empire, an FBI agent or a federal agent of some kind, who looks like he's going to be the same kind of guy. And I wonder, Jen, if that guy is some kind of placeholder for the people we run into on the internet who also seem to have divorced
like the
themselves.
Comment trolls, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's fascinating. And I think of guilt as almost this purposeful thing that's there in you, reminding you of the person you want to be, which I think, you guys talked about a little bit earlier. So if you don't feel any of that, then are you already this person? Or, and if you think that you're the person that you want to be already, then you probably are a psychopath, right? I think comment trolls, for example, maybe aren't quite that, because I think they're kind of more acting out to get attention in some way, which probably you could speak to more on a psychological level.
And we're going to come back to sociopaths in just a second, though. I do want to add to the conversation Ruth Whitman. Ruth Whitman is a British writer living in California, working on a book proposal about happiness in America. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Huffington Post, The Independent. Ruth Whitman, earlier, Hank Schwartz was talking about people whose sense of guilt and all the other attendant faculties that go along with that is so highly developed that they're basically able to go through their day not doing things that they would feel guilty about. This is something that you've written about, too, about having a genetically robust guilt drawn from two totally distinct self-flagellating ethnicities. Tell us a little bit more about that kind of guilt.
Well, I definitely think that I'm one of those people whose guilt is somehow in overdrive. I mean, about the two self-flagellating ethnicities, as I described it. I'm half Jewish on my father's side, so the wrong half. Something to feel guilty about with the in-laws. And then on my mother's side, I've got the kind of Protestant, mend and make do, that kind of thrifty guilt, coming down that line. So I think the two of them, work together to just kind of, have this generalized fog of guilt that I do feel pretty much every day.
Actually, I think you had a big event in your life in the last couple of days that's kind of a perfect summation of that kind of cross rip of guilt. You want to mention that?
Sure. Well, yeah, absolutely. I just had a baby, just coming up for 3 weeks ago, and yesterday we had his bris, his ritual circumcision, to welcome him into the Jewish community, and obviously that was quite an emotionally charged event, and one that was absolutely ripe with possibilities for guilt at every level. But
we can imagine. Actually, if it'll make you feel any better, I'll just quickly tell you a story, which is that my son, who is adopted and Mexican, we had to wait a few weeks before actually sort of getting our hands on him and bringing him into our lives. So he was, first 3 weeks of his life, he was under the care of other people, and we had decided for health reasons to have him circumcised. So we did it, and like other people had to deal with it, and he wasn't too happy about it afterwards. And this woman named Mrs. Garcia kept calling us from El Paso, going, "He has a temper. He didn't like that." So think how guilty I feel. I wasn't even there to suffer the consequences.
This is a nearly ubiquitous Jewish parent phenomenon.
Well, Hank Schwartz is kind of interesting because I think every culture, too, thinks that it has the worst guilt. Jews think they have the worst guilt. Irish Catholics think they have the worst guilt. Protestants think they have the worst guilt. There's sort of a bragging right to the attendant misery, right?
Absolutely. Preparing for this show, I Googled Jewish guilt, Catholic guilt, Protestant guilt, and it is remarkable. Everybody thinks they've got it. Every ethnic group has it. The truth of the matter is it's a pretty universal phenomenon. And it's pretty universally bashed. I never thought I'd wind up coming on this show today and wind up defending guilt. But I have to point out that most psychological phenomena appear across a spectrum with two sides of the coin. If you're a macho person on the surface, you're usually longing for dependency beneath the surface. And to the degree to which we experience guilt in moderation, again, it's very, very connected to the sense of positive self-regard, because the corrections that we make lead us to do things that make us feel we are living out our ego ideal. We are the person that we wanted to be, and we get a sense of positive self-regard from that. That's important.
That's, though, if we're reading the IKEA instructions to our life properly, right? If you experience guilt here, right. Affix wingnut B to bold C, whereas Jen Dahl, I think a lot of us probably experience guilt and don't make the self-correction that Hank is talking about. I mean, the gift lies in knowing to do that, right?
Well,
right, and also knowing who the person you want to be actually is. I think that's a hard thing to figure out, and we're faced with lots of visuals of what that person should look like, maybe, or stories about how that person should act. But the balance of figuring out who you are and want to be, and, you know, these different images you see and stories you hear, I think that's maybe the hardest part.
Hey, Ruth Whitman, is this your first child, this baby?
No, my second child. So we've already been through it all once before.
Well, you know, the other thing that I discovered preparing for this show. That's right. I have to get out and take a little break here in just a second. But all right, I better not open this. Well, I'll mention it. We can think about it. We have like just a few minutes of fundraising we'll have to go through. So I'll let Ruth kind of think about this. But as I was getting ready for the show, I discovered there's this huge cottage industry in dealing with mommy guilt, that mothers today feel so guilty about everything, every choice they make, formula versus breastfeeding, going out and getting some exercise, leaving the kid with a sitter. Everything that they do is potentially so wrong that there's this enormous cottage industry in somehow or other plugging up or soothing the feelings of mommy guilt. There's no way apparently to be a guilt-free mother anymore. So I'll let Ruth chew on that one during the break, and Jen and Hank Schwartz will be back with more guilt talk after this short intermission.
I lied to the bishop.
I forgot my mother's birthday.
I did something really awful too.
Dear Ann Landers, my husband Bert brings crossword puzzles when we go out to restaurants and then works on them rather than talking to me. In order to get his attention, I roofied his drink, and since then I've been keeping him cold, naked, and frightened in our semi-darkened basement. My question to you is, how hard is it to operate a gas grill? That's something Bert used to do, and now I really miss grilled chicken. Today's show was produced by Patrick Scahill, Betsy Kaplan, and me, with help from our interns, Jonathan Scranton and Garrett Connolly. The part of Bill Curry was played by Martin Luther. On tomorrow's show, the nose goes to New Haven and investigates the Elm City Poopatrator. And now, back to Colin.
We're not going to talk to you about the Poopatrator right now, but talk about something that needs a Freudian interpretation. The Poopatrator would be that. All right, so joining us right now, Hank Schwartz, Ruth Whitman, and Jen Dahl are all of our guests. We're going to get back to them, particularly on the subject of mommy guilt. Before we do that, there's some people who've been holding on at 860-275-7266. I feel guilty that they haven't gotten on the air yet. 860-275-7266. I've got three experts here who can help you. Here's Brian in Suffield. Hi, Brian. You're on the air.
Hi. I wanted to ask if there's such a thing as a pathology wherein people seek out feelings of guilt. And just to give a personal example, I am Jewish. I do have an uncircumcised son. So did Derrida. I don't feel that much guilt about that, I don't think. I am married to a non-Jew. I don't think I feel that much guilt about that. I think that's still pretty innocuous. But I'm wondering if there's something I should be worried about. I am I make my living as a church organist. And I'm working through it, and I do feel complex about it. And then, you know, I have a complex relationship with my father, who doesn't, of course, but he didn't finish his PhD, and I sort of am realizing that I am probably not going to finish my PhD, and I'm wondering if this is a pattern. Would you see this, Dr. Schwartz, as a pattern of presenting someone seeking out guilt as if to confront something, or should I be worried about this?
Or you're seeking out. I didn't hear the verb the first time you used it. Seeking out guilt. I think a number of our guests may want to comment on this. Brian, I think I want to do a whole show with you. So you're I love the fact that before they comment. So one of your areas of guilt is that you're Jewish, but you're a church organist? That's one of your areas of guilt? Do I have that right? Oh, he had to go. All right, I'm sorry about that. And then I love the fact that he has an uncircumcised child, and he says, but Derrida did too. How many people invoke Jacques Derrida in that circumstance? All right, so I guess he's not there anymore, which is too bad. It'd be fun to talk to him. He sounds like a very interesting person. Hank, he did invoke you, so I'll let you talk first about this notion of seeking out guilt.
Well, I don't know about seeking it out, but Freud did talk about a repetition compulsion, where, you know, we have a conflict, and we are continually trying to rework the same thing in one situation after another. Those of you who have been married 2 or 3 times are familiar with that.
All right. And Jen, any reactions to Brian and all of his unresolved areas?
Yeah, I guess if you're seeking out guilt, or if you think you're seeking out guilt, you would just have to ask why are you doing that, maybe? You know, is he not feeling like was this an orchestrated attempt to make himself feel something or to change the way that he was living or is living? Or is it just that he's afraid that he won't finish his PhD and he really wants to, in which case maybe he could use that to kind of push him forward and get that done?
You know, Ruth Whitman, I want to get to mommy guilt in just a second here, but one thing that I hear a little bit with Brian, and I hear it a lot with other people, is sometimes people sort of package up the whole thing in a conversation with you. They say, I want to do this, but I'm going to feel guilty about it, so tell me I can do it. You know, I don't know what the word for that. It's sort of like guilt trolling or something. They basically sort of bring up the thing that they could potentially feel guilty about and try to get you to give them permission to go ahead and do it on a guilt-free basis.
Right. Well, I think sometimes feeling guilt sort of almost allows you to have a foot in both camps. You know, I know with myself that I can sometimes make a decision, say I worry that I'm going out to work and leaving my son in daycare. But the fact that I feel guilty about it kind of exonerates me in a way and lets me kind of slightly have a foot in the stay-at-home mommy camp rather than just thinking, right, I'm going out to work and I don't care. Do you know what I mean? So it somehow, lets you off the hook a little bit.
Do you feel, in terms of that mommy guilt thing, I don't know whether that resonated with you when I was talking about it before, but it does seem like there's so many different models right now for how to be a mother in today's society and what you do with the rest of your life and how much time you devote to your kids. And, there's no real default setting. Instead, it's just this wide menu of choices that people almost inevitably feel like they must be doing something wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost like it's a job requirement if you're going to be a mother that you have to feel guilty. And if you don't feel guilty, you're somehow doing a bad job. I mean, I was in the park recently and I overheard this woman saying, I think I'm a fantastic mother. And it really pulled me up short. I thought, my goodness, the fact that she said, instead of thinking, oh, good on you, you're so confident in what you're doing, I was thinking, well, you can't be a great mother if you think you are. If you're not feeling guilty, then you must be doing something wrong. And I think it's so ingrained that mothers really, our starting point is that we're doing something wrong, and then, we work from that.
Hank, this is a way that kind of the model has probably changed a little bit. I mean, I think you and I grew up in an era where at least everybody sort of thought they knew what mothers were supposed to do, and there were cultural biases about it and other kinds of sort of prefabricated ideas about how to be a mother. I'm guessing that today, one of today's big, fountains of neurosis is that whole idea that I'm a mom and I want to work and I must be doing something wrong. I'm shortchanging somebody somehow.
Well, as far as we have come, or really, not come since the 60s and 70s beginnings of women's liberation, I think it remains true that there's just no – and it's a reality that, in fact, it remains as hard as it ever was for women to both pursue careers and to fulfill their desire to be, a mom at home. And I think that continues to create legitimate conflict, and as our standards, getting back to the notion of an ego ideal, that's sort of part of the superego. Our standards, women's standards for what a mother should be doing, what a father should be doing also, it pertains to, to both, have grown so enormously. We talk about helicoptering parents. Did your parents helicopter over you, Colin?
They kind of, yes. I was an only child, so my parents did helicopter.
Well, and you're a little younger than I am also. But back in my generation, parents weren't doing that. Mm-hmm. They didn't hold themselves up to that expectation. So in a way, the cultural ideal, in addition to the individual ideals that parents hold themselves up to, and especially mothers today, have changed in a way that I think make it even tougher. And still create parents who are even likely to be more guilt-prone.
Yeah, I mean, if you can picture a helicopter with a spotlight beaming down, chasing a solitary figure across a darkened landscape, that's the kind of helicopter parents I had. But that's like a whole other story, and that is billable time. Before we run out of time, Jen Dahl, there's nothing I enjoy more than taking a person your age and appointing them a spokesperson for their entire generation and the experience of digital life. So that's what you're going to get to do. But no, I'm sort of wondering whether, in fact, we live in an environment where there are new avenues of guilt, and I'm thinking of stuff like Facebook, where you might have to unfriend somebody, or where, in fact, you might be talking about something that somebody else didn't get invited to, or the tendency to get into flame wars on Twitter. I don't know. Do you feel like digital life brings out different things that you can wind up feeling guilty for?
I don't know if it brings out different things, but I think it brings out more of the same things in a different way. So you're promoting this brand of you, I quotes over the word brand, but if you don't match up with what you think that you're putting forward, you may feel deeply guilty in yourself. You also might not be having a great day, and you say that and people react in a strange way, or you look at other people saying these great things about themselves, like best day ever, so excited I just got engaged and I won the Pulitzer, and you're like, ugh, well, I can never do any of that. So I think that it's just another method of guilt on you, kind of.
Hank, this sort of brings up also the difference between guilt and shame, assuming there is a difference between guilt and shame. And if there is one, I think we imagine anyway that shame comes from the gaze of others, that we experience guilt pretty much internally. Now, maybe we're experiencing it internally as a result of external forces like what our parents taught us or those kinds of things that we've internalized. But whereas shame, I think, is that notion that if people come to know the truth about me, they will know, as Jen Dahl said, that this public person that I've created, this version of me, which I basically market to the rest of the world, is to some degree or other fraudulent.
Yes, and shame is experienced in the eyes of others. And it is a kind of more profound global judgment of our wrongness. You can be guilty about things and you can correct the situation that is producing the guilt. Shame is a more global sense of something being absolutely wrong with yourself, and so it's more pervasive and in a way I think more damaging.
Ruth, though, in some of the ways that Jen is talking about, too, that representation of happiness that we see as people get more and more porous with the membranes of their public lives, or at least versions of their public lives, that does sort of invite this whole new opportunity to feel guilt and shame because, and I know you're writing about happiness right now, that you haven't attained the happiness that somehow or other now is the imagined default setting for a modern American life.
Absolutely. I mean, I think happiness has become this kind of, the pursuit of happiness has become this real sort of drive for self-improvement and to do everything fantastically well and to look amazing and to be amazing and to look amazing to everyone else on Facebook. And it's kind of sucked the joy out of happiness in a way, because it can mean that, happiness feels like work, another thing to tick off your to-do list and another thing to feel guilty about, that, I'm not achieving the right amount of happiness, whereas actually happiness should be something that, sort of comes more naturally and more, with an element of joy to it.
Yeah, quick comment from Hank, and then I want to squeeze Teddy on the air before I run out of time.
I think on this issue, Freud had it right when he said he wanted to turn neurotic misery into ordinary, everyday unhappiness. That's the more reasonable goal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but from Ruth's point of view, the line from the service, "This is the day which the Lord hath made," and all you've done is screw it up. All right, here's Teddy from East Haven. Hi, Teddy, you're on the air.
Hi, Colin. Thank you. I'm 81, and I was raised in the Midwest where parents at that time were quite strict, and you were always made to feel guilty. And you were made to feel guilty, which created you into being a people pleaser. It also, however, over long term, makes you extremely self-centered. And I think that's an aspect of guilt it took me a long time to realize.
self-centered in the sense that you wind up thinking that you are the mechanism by which, in fact, the world either stands or falls. That you're so guilt-driven that if you screw up somehow or other, there's this huge domino effect that it pollutes all of reality. That kind of self-centered.
Well, more that you can fix everything for the people around you so that you don't have to feel guilty that their lives are bad.
Right. Well, give yourself permission not to feel that. Have you given yourself permission not to feel that?
Absolutely. I have 4 wonderful adult children who used to remind me all the time that I did the best I could while I had an opportunity, and the rest is up to them. I don't have to worry. So I also don't worry about myself. I am the way I am.
All right. Thanks so much for your call. Let me just look at the clock here. Yeah, we've got about a minute left. That is, Hank, if you could do it in 60 seconds, that's sort of one part of the disease, right, that we put ourselves at the center of everything. And some of our guilt that we bring onto ourselves is out of this mistaken belief that we really do have the power, that much power to alter all of reality.
That would be a very, very hypertrophied superego, yes, and some of us have it. And, that's probably created some really tremendously positive works in the world, but at very, very, very great cost to the people who have that kind of sense of themselves.
All right. Great show. Jen Dahl, Ruth Whipping, Hank Schwartz. You guys have all been just fabulous guests. I'm going to go home early. I don't feel guilty about it. Thanks to Betsy Kaplan, who pulled this show together. And we'll be back tomorrow live from New Haven with The Nose and The Poopa Trader. I can't even tell you about it just yet.
Just ain't enough.
I'm Kyone Wolf. Jesus died for you. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And you don't even feel bad about it. What's that about, kid? Yes, that's better.